Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're jumping into a really major shift in world history,
That's right.
the independence of African colonies,
Yeah.
specifically after World War II.
Yeah, a huge turning point. We've got some background material touching on, democracy's earlier development, imperialism.
Right, and how that all sets the stage. So this deep dive, our goal is to unpack how the weakening of European empires after the war really opened the door for independent nations across Africa.
Exactly. And looking at the hopes, but also the very real challenges they faced right from the start. It connects back to those earlier ideas, self-determination from the American and French revolutions.
Finding new life in Africa.
Precisely. For listeners wanting to grasp these big historical shifts quickly, this should be pretty fascinating. We'll connect the dots: end of a war, decline of empires, birth of nations.
Okay, let's get into it. To really understand this, we need to look at some key places and people. First up, Ghana.
Ghana, yes. Formerly the British colony, the Gold Coast.
And it's important because it was the first sub-Saharan African country to gain independence, right? In 1957.
That's the one. 1957. It was hugely symbolic. It basically sent a message across the continent.
Like it's possible.
Exactly. It showed that, yes, colonial rule could be overcome. It was a real, tangible example for others still fighting for freedom.
And central to Ghana's story is Kwame Nkrumah.
Absolutely essential. Nkrumah was the driving force behind independence, became Ghana's first president.
And he championed Pan-Africanism.
Hmm.
What does that mean exactly in this context?
Well, it was this powerful idea, this vision of a unified Africa, all these different nations, despite their diverse histories, coming together.
United, independent, cooperative.
Yeah, aiming for self-governance across the continent, a strong collective voice on the world stage. Nkrumah was a huge proponent of that.
And that idea led to something concrete, didn't it? The Organization of African Unity.
It did. The OAU, founded in 1963, it was meant to be the platform for that cooperation.
So promoting unity, solidarity.
And crucially, working together to eradicate colonialism completely from Africa. It really showed that growing sense of shared identity, of common purpose.
But as you said, challenges. The path wasn't always like Ghana's. Let's take Kenya, another British colony.
Right, Kenya. And the story there involves the Mau Mau uprising. It was a much more violent struggle.
So the Mau Mau movement, who were they? What was their goal?
It was a nationalist movement, mostly involving the Kikuyu people. They used armed resistance against British rule, mainly in the 1950s.
So armed struggle versus political negotiation.
Exactly. It just highlights that there wasn't one single way independence happened. Some transitions were political, others involved significant conflict when colonial powers wouldn't let go easily.
Okay, now let's shift to the Belgian Congo. That one has a reputation for being particularly brutal under colonial rule.
Oh, absolutely. Notoriously harsh, very exploitative. And when independence came in 1960, well, it wasn't a smooth transition.
Understatement.
Yeah, it was chaotic, marked by political instability almost immediately.
Why was it so chaotic compared to, say, Ghana?
Well, part of it was the legacy of that really harsh rule. There was very little investment in, building local institutions or leadership that could actually govern effectively.
So the foundations weren't there.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that kind of vacuum, unfortunately, can allow authoritarian figures to step in. Which leads us to Mobutu Sese Seko.
Right. Mobutu, he took power not long after independence, didn't he?
Yeah, seized power in a coup in 1965. He then ruled the Congo, which he renamed Zaire, for over 3 decades?
Wow, 30 years. And his rule wasn't exactly democratic.
Not at all. Authoritarian regime. It really exemplifies the massive difficulties many new nations faced trying to establish stable democratic governments after colonialism just, ended abruptly in some cases.
The infrastructure, politically and socially, just wasn't always ready.
Precisely. Internal power struggles, weak democratic traditions left over.
Yeah.
It could lead down that path. Now, another very different case, Algeria.
French colony. And this one had a large population of European settlers, right? Which complicated things.
Hugely complicated things.
Yeah.
It meant France saw Algeria less as a colony and more as, part of France itself.
Which made letting go much harder.
Much harder. And the fight for independence there was long, intense, and very bloody, led primarily by the FLN.
The National Liberation Front. They waged an armed struggle.
Yes, a full-blown war against French rule. It lasted from 1954 to 1962, brutal conflict on both sides.
So much longer and more violent than even Kenya's struggle.
Definitely. The settler presence was key. The FLN, though, with leaders like Ahmed Ben Bella, eventually succeeded, but the human cost was immense.
And Ben Bella became the first president of independent Algeria.
He did, marking the end of that really difficult chapter.
So looking at all these examples, Ghana's political path, Kenya's uprising, Congo's chaos, Algeria's long war, the overall significance of this whole period really comes into focus.
It really does. I mean, fundamentally, it signals the end of European empires dominating Africa, a
Yeah.
massive shift in global power.
How much was that driven by WWII weakening the European powers?
A lot. The war exhausted them, financially and morally. It weakened their grip. But just as important was the rise of nationalism within the colonies themselves.
That desire for self-determination.
Exactly. Echoing those earlier revolutionary ideas, but now taking root powerfully across Africa. People demanding the right to govern themselves.
Leaders like Nkrumah really embodied that, didn't they?
They absolutely did. They articulated that desire to reject foreign rule and, chart their own course.
And we saw that Pan-African spirit, the OAU, trying to foster unity.
Yeah, that sense of shared destiny, that maybe a united Africa could be stronger, freer from outside interference. That was a powerful dream then.
But the reality, as we saw with the Congo and Mobutu, was often difficult. These new nations inherited huge problems.
Huge problems. Establishing stable governments was maybe the biggest immediate hurdle, but also overcoming the colonial legacy itself.
What kinds of legacies are we talking about?
Well, think about the borders. Drawn by Europeans, often cutting across ethnic groups, lumping others together arbitrarily.
Creating built-in tension.
Right. And economies designed to extract resources for Europe, not for local development. Political systems imposed from outside. It was a really complex inheritance.
And dealing with internal divisions, sometimes made worse by colonial divide and rule tactics.
Absolutely. All these things made building stable, unified, democratic nations incredibly challenging. Mobutu's rise is, sadly, just one example of how things could go wrong when those foundations were weak.
And it's crucial to remember the diversity of experiences. Ghana versus Kenya versus Algeria versus Congo, completely different paths.
Totally different. Depends on the colonizer, the local conditions, the type of resistance. There's no single story of African independence. The Belgian Congo's rapid, unprepared handover versus Algeria's protracted war, vastly different scenarios.
Stepping back, though, what was the impact on the world stage, all these new countries emerging?
Massive impact. Suddenly you have dozens of new voices in international forums like the UN.
Giving Africa a much bigger say in global politics.
A much stronger collective voice than ever before. They could advocate for their interests, push agendas related to decolonization elsewhere, development, non-alignment during the Cold War.
It really changed the dynamics in those international bodies.
Definitely. New perspectives, new priorities challenging the old power structures. Issues like self-determination and economic justice got a much higher profile.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear the independence of African colonies post-WWII was, well, epoch-making.
Absolutely. A fundamental reshaping of the world map. The end of direct European rule, the start of a new era of self-governance for the continent.
An era filled with hope, but as we've seen, also immense challenges rooted in that colonial past.
Exactly. The transition wasn't easy, experiences varied wildly, but it empowered African nations to pursue their own futures, however difficult that proved to be.
So a final thought to leave our listeners with. Considering those different paths and those initial hopes for unity like the OAU represented, what do you think were the most stubborn, long-lasting impacts of colonialism that really continued to shape Africa long after the flags changed?
That's a deep question.
And maybe, looking back with hindsight, were there realistic alternative paths? Could things have unfolded differently, perhaps avoiding some of the instability or conflict, given the historical forces at play? Something to think about.